All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Strength and Power. So I wanted to make a video about Paul Dillet. So Paul Dillet, I've made a couple of videos about him in the past, but in this particular video, I want to talk about Paul Dillet's best year ever and the best physique that he ever had. Now, Paul Dillet was arguably one of the biggest bodybuilders to be kind of a forgotten bodybuilder and did not place too highly at the Mr. Olympia, but he did place within the top six pretty much every appearance he made at the Olympia. And that is, of course, with the exception of the 1998 and 1999 Olympias, both of which he placed outside of the top six. But from the year he turned pro in 1993 to about 1997, he would be a perennial top six competitor in the 90s Olympias. And that's really saying something, guys. I mean, if you think about it, the 90s, a lot of people refer to the 90s as the golden era of bodybuilding rather than the 70s because the level of competition in the 1990s was just so high. I mean, the caliber of the Olympia lineup in the early 90s especially was probably one of the most competitive, if not the most competitive eras in bodybuilding because those lineups were just so good. Now, Paul Dillet is actually one of my personal favorite bodybuilders. I know you guys already know that Lee Priest is my favorite bodybuilder from a physique standpoint, but Paul Dillet, just from the sheer freakiness of his physique, even though he's never won a major title like the Arnold Classic or the Mr. Olympia, I think his physique is one of the craziest physiques to ever step on the Olympia stage. And his posing in particular of the crucifix pose and the victory pose, I think he is one of the most impressive bodybuilders aside from the likes of a Lee Priest or a Sergio Oliva to hit that crucifix pose or that victory pose because his arms are just so insane. His upper body is so insane. And when he was in shape, the ratio of that kind of V-taper frame that he had of the lats to the small waist and those insanely big arms just created this crazy crucifix pose, which was probably why both of his nicknames in bodybuilding were either Jurassic Paul Dillet or Freakenstein. So that just goes to show how crazy this guy was. And to give you guys a little bit more information about the guy, he was about 6'1" tall or 185.5 centimeters. So relatively tall for a professional bodybuilder. And his body weight on stage was anywhere from 295 to 310 pounds. And there are some reports of him even getting up to as heavy as 330 pounds in the offseason. So a very big bodybuilder for his day. I mean, a lot of people give credit to Dorian Yates as being the first mass monster, the earliest mass monster to come to the sport. But I think a lot of people neglect to mention Paul Dillet because he was really a mass monster for that era. It just so happened that he wasn't that competitive against a guy like Dorian Yates. So getting back to Paul Dillet's best look ever. So like I said, he was a perennial top six competitor at the Mr. Olympia. His best placing at the Olympia would be at the 1994 Mr. Olympia. And let me tell you guys, that 1994 Olympia lineup was absolutely stacked. And during that same year in 1994, he would win a handful of the Grand Prix competitions and place at the top three in a handful of those Grand Prix. So I would say 1994 was probably one of his best looks, if not his best look, culminating in that 1994 Olympia fourth place finish, arguably the biggest distinction of his career. So just to give you guys some perspective, winning that Olympia was Dorian Yates. In second place, you had Sean Ray. In third place, you had Kevin Levrone. So you would have Paul Dillet in those callouts with Sean Ray, Kevin, and Dorian, arguably the greatest bodybuilders of the 1990s. But let's go into the list of amazing bodybuilders that Paul Dillet beat out at that year's Olympia, because that Olympia lineup was very, very deep. He beat Porter Cottrell, who came in fifth, Chris Cormier, who came in sixth, Nasser El Sambadi, who came in seventh, who would be a runner-up at the Olympia a couple of years later. Charles Claremont, in my opinion, one of the most aesthetic bodybuilders of all time. Andreas Munzer, in my opinion, one of the most shredded bodybuilders of all time. Sonny Schmidt, Al Q. Gurley, Aaron Baker, Milos Sarcev, Thierry Pastel, Ronnie Coleman coming in 15th place in 1994. You also had Akeem Albrecht, who would become a pro wrestler. And, of course, you had Samir Bannout, a former Mr. Olympia winner. You had David Dirth and Mike Quinn, both of whom were returning from the WBF, World Bodybuilding Federation, which Vince McMahon started in the early 90s, so they weren't placing very well once they came back to the IFBB. And then you had Gunter Schlierkamp as well, another guy that would be a top threat to Ronnie Coleman. So coming in fourth place out of a total of 23 competitors, Olympia-level competitors, is a very impressive feat. And keep in mind, man, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but if you go back to the Olympias that Arnold Schwarzenegger won back in the 70s, some of those Olympias had 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 if it was a really stacked Olympia, 4 competitors at the Olympia. So now you're competing against 23 guys. So the Olympia caliber jumped significantly from the 70s to the 90s. But yeah, man, 1994, I think, was one of Paul Dillet's best looks ever. I mean, he had the veins that would go across his chest, and he was in such good condition, man, when he would hit that crucifix pose. The veins, you could see the veins travel through his arms, through his chest, over to the other arm. Just the level of conditioning was insane in 1994. Now, the problem that he would run into in future years would be his posing was a little bit awkward at times, and he wasn't the best poser. But another thing would be his conditioning. Sometimes he would come in with off conditioning. But an interesting thing here, as I mentioned earlier, is that Ronnie Coleman, a young Ronnie Coleman, competed at this Olympia. So there's some shots of Paul Dillet next to Ronnie Coleman where he is absolutely dwarfing Ronnie. But overall, I wouldn't really say Paul Dillet's like an uncrowned Mr. Olympia or anything like that. I would say, his back was kind of a weak point for him. There wasn't very much detail. There wasn't very much separation. I think that would be one of the things that would really hold him back, as well as his conditioning and his posing. But I do think he was one of the greatest bodybuilders of the 1990s, just not necessarily deserving of a Mr. Olympia win. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about Paul Dillet's physique in 1994 specifically. Thank you guys for watching the video, and please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it.